everyone. Welcome to Building the Movement Beyond Bernie 2020. So glad to see so many people here. If you are typing in chat and you want to send a message to the whole group, so that's panelists and other audience members, make sure in your chat it's set to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see what you're saying if you want to talk to other attendees. Okay, so thank you again so much, everyone, for being here. Really nice turnout. So glad to see everyone. My name is Laura Wadlin, and I'm on the leadership of our local DSA for Bernie campaign in Portland, DSA. And we are so excited to present this panel to discuss how we can continue to build a radical working class movement. I know a lot of us Bernie supporters are feeling some combination of devastated and disoriented. So hopefully at the end of this webinar, you'll leave with an idea of how we can go forward and take advantage of the current political movement. But before I introduce our panelists, I just have a quick poll. Are you a DSA member? So you should see a poll now. Are you a DSA member? Yes, Portland DSA. Yes, but not in Portland, or not a member yet. So go ahead and vote real quick. Wow, looks like we have 41% of the people on this call are not a member yet. That is amazing. And it's great, actually. We're always happy to have new and non-members at our DSA events, and we hope that you will consider joining. So we're going to hear from each of our panelists. Oh, sorry, let me share these results. There we go. So we're going to hear from each of our panelists individually first, and then we'll have an extended Q&A period with all of them. And if at any point you have a question for a panelist or for the whole group, please submit it in the Q&A box that's different from the chat box. So in your Zoom interface, you should have a button that says Q&A. So make sure to submit questions for the panel in the Q&A box, not the chat box, because people probably won't be reading all of chat. And then we'll pose audience questions to the panelists after they've all had a chance to speak. Alrighty. So let's get started with our panel. We're going to start with Meagan Day. Meagan is a staff writer at Jacobin and co-author of the new book, Bigger Than Bernie. Go ahead, Meagan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on this call. It's really a pleasure. I'm a member of East Bay DSA, so you know, just the next biggest city to your south, I think, that has a DSA chapter. Yeah, so we're neighbors. So yeah, I was brought on to talk a little bit about what we've won and what we've lost coming out of the Bernie 2020 campaign. And I would say also probably coming out of the last half decade of a sort of extended Bernie Sanders presidential campaign. I'll speak for myself and say that I think probably like many of you, especially those of you who are members of Portland DSA, I became a socialist directly because of Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign, or at least an organized socialist. I was a sort of socialist sympathizer for a while before then. And I have never known a time as an organized socialist when it wasn't possible to have a Bernie Sanders presidency. Not necessarily likely. I never really let myself believe until the Nevada caucus that it was likely that Bernie Sanders was going to be president. And then I'll admit, I was in Las Vegas, I was at a strip caucus, and it was very hard not to believe in that moment that Bernie Sanders was going to be our president. But in any case, yeah, I've always thought that Bernie Sanders could be the president of the United States, and it has been the backdrop of my life as a socialist organizer. And now that it's no longer possible, to be realistic about it, that changes a lot. It's like we're stepping from a sort of, I think of it as like a BC to AD shift. It really feels like we're in a different timeline now. So it's important for us to take stock of what precisely we've gained and what we've lost. The reason for that is because if we don't have, if we haven't performed an honest assessment of the political terrain, then we're not going to know how to proceed on it. And people have emotional reactions that are perfectly understandable. Some people's defense mechanisms kick in and they just do kind of like, you know, sort of like maybe basic cheerleading. They're like, you know, the struggle continues, like not me, us, political revolution. And some people have the exact opposite reaction, and they kind of get extremely despondent and nihilistic, and sometimes extremely cruel to other people who express a shred of optimism. I don't think either of these is appropriate, to be honest. I think that we've won a lot, and we've also lost a lot. So let me break that down a little bit. The main thing that we lost was the opportunity to have Bernie Sanders be the president of the United States, and that's really it's really heartbreaking in a lot of ways. I mean, there are some real material implications to it. For example, climate crisis is not going anywhere anytime soon, and every year that we don't have aggressive action around climate is a year that we don't get back. And having that action emanate from the White House would obviously make everything significantly easier. The fact that it's not going to emanate from the White House means that we have to organize for it on our own, which we were always going to have to do in a supplementary way, but now we have to do it with an antagonist, to be quite honest, in the White House. You know, maybe varying degrees of antagonism, but still. The same is true for the pandemic. I mean, coming out of this crisis, neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden, however, whatever differences we might want to demarcate between the two of them, and I think they're real, neither of them has the tools to be able to actually get us out of this crisis in a way that doesn't cause mass avoidable and yet unavoided working class misery. Those tools, of course, being, you know, wealth redistribution, universal social programs, the direct distribution of universal aid, nationalization, expropriation, requisitioning private stockpiles. These things are not in the political imagination or the political vocabulary of either Donald Trump or Joe Biden at the end of the day. And of course, we lost the opportunity to make a break from the sort of protracted crisis for working class people that's been proceeding apace for 4 or 5 decades now at this point. The constant grinding agenda of austerity and privatization that only seems to proceed in one direction, which is the rightward direction, only leading to one outcome ever, which is expanded and constantly expanding inequality and deterioration of the quality of life for working class people, including reversing life expectancy, which is really shocking when you think about it, in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. Okay, so yeah, let's be honest, that's a lot to lose. That really sucks. I think that we could all allow ourselves to feel how bad it feels that we didn't get an opportunity to intervene, have someone on our side, one of ours up there in the White House helping us intervene, and vice versa in that state of affairs. That said, it's not only possible to compare our current scenario to what it would be like if Bernie were in the White House. It's also possible to compare our current scenario to what it would be like if Bernie Sanders had not run at all. And in that case, if we do that sort of mental exercise, we can see that all of the above would be the exact same, absolutely exactly the same. And what we wouldn't have done is we wouldn't have gained a reborn socialist movement, a re-energized and significantly expanded, broader progressive or social democratic movement. And just some things that Bernie Sanders was able to do on a mass scale that you don't really get unless you do national electoral politics, which isn't to say that they're a superior form of politics. They have their shortcomings as well. But, you know, if all we got out of this was a host of ideological victories, that would in fact be an awful lot. As Marxists, of course, we understand that we need material victories in order to actually transform the conditions of working class life. But at the same time, we also need to set people in motion in order to organize for those victories. And the ideological victories are a precondition for setting people into motion, because people aren't brave enough to act if they don't feel that they are not brave enough to do things like organize their coworkers on the job, or like run for office themselves, or join socialist organizations, if they fundamentally don't feel that politics can change anything. And what Bernie Sanders has successfully done is, even in losing, has introduced to millions of people the idea that politics can fundamentally change the current state of affairs and can improve their lives in ways that they previously thought were unimprovable through any means besides their own personal advancement, which of course is thwarted at every turn for most working class people. So I think that the main thing coming out of not just Bernie 2020, but Bernie 2015 through 2020, is raised expectations of the working class. Naturally, we would have preferred, having someone in the White House who wanted to fight for and implement Medicare for all, but we're on much better footing now for Medicare for all and for a host of other platform demands. Medicare for all, tuition-free college, Green New Deal, student and medical debt cancellation, and those are just the main pillars. We're on much better footing to fight for those, and workplace rights, higher wages, than we were prior to Bernie Sanders running. One of the reasons for that is not just an expanded political worldview, which I think is really important and we can't discount, but also a new progressive and socialist institutional ecosystem, including media organizations, activist organizations, chief among them DSA, I would say, and introducing these to each other, introducing, for example, readers to magazines like Jacobin, introducing people who are fired up and ready to fight for a better world to organizations that they can join and be a part of 24/7, 365, to do not just electoral organizing, but non-electoral organizing as well, and introducing people to each other, introducing all of these formerly isolated, alienated, would-be socialists and progressives to each other with a message delivered by the Bernie Sanders campaign that collective action gets the goods, and a broadly expanded political worldview, a raised sense of expectations, and a new political vocabulary and a political identity to actually take action together and change the world. Micah's going to say more about that, but that's the best I can do for an honest accounting of what we've lost and what we've won. And honestly, I think that we've won more than we've lost here. Go ahead, Micah.
Let me introduce Micah real quick. Thank you so much, Meagan. So Micah Uetricht is the managing editor of Jacobin. He's the host of the Jacobin radio podcast, The Vast Majority, and author of Strike for America, Chicago Teachers Against Austerity. He previously worked as a labor organizer and is a member of the Democratic Socialist America in Chicago. Go ahead, Micah.
Thanks. I would say that a good marker of the progress that's been made in the left over the last couple of years is that I came to Portland in 2014 to talk about a book that I wrote about the Chicago Teachers Union. Maybe some of you who are here were at that discussion. And there were, I think, maybe 10 of us, 11 of us. It was organized by socialists. And on this call, we got some people in the chat saying they were there. I think Johanna Brenner, who I think was on this call, she was there. And now we've got on this call, there's like 70 or 80 people. So, I mean, that in itself is a good marker of the kind of progress that's been made. I think that, Meagan laid out what was lost and what's been gained through Bernie Sanders' campaign. There's been this sort of discussion that Meagan and I have been observing that the only way that people who are, people on the left who are talking about the end of the Bernie campaign, the only way that they feel they're being intellectually honest about it is to be extremely upset and say that, we've lost. And anybody trying to say that we've actually made some really serious gains is not being truly intellectually honest. But the truth is that we, as a socialist movement, came up against forces that were far more powerful than anything that we had managed to amass over the past 5 years. I mean, if you remember, as I said, sort of before 2016, there basically was the socialist movement that existed in the United States was not anything but marginal in this country. It played little role. There certainly was no DSA, for example, with 80 people coming on a Zoom call on a Friday night in a city like Portland. And 5 years later, we're now at this point where we started from zero. We actually credibly believed for a moment that we might be able to elect Democratic Socialists the presidency of the United States. Some of us allowed ourselves to really actually believe that was something that was going to happen. And now we find ourselves reeling from that loss, but also with this whole movement that wasn't here before. And I think that DSA in particular has a really critical role to play in the years to come. I mean, things would be extremely, extremely bleak right now if we did not have this reborn socialist movement that we are all a part of. If we didn't have these revived expectations, these newly raised expectations that we now have. And I think that, obviously it's not automatic that we're going to be able to translate those, the raised expectations into concrete gains. But if those are going to come about, people like you all who are in the DSA or hopefully are going to join the DSA very soon are going to play a really critical role in making that happen. I mean, every important struggle that's happening around the country right now, the DSA is really at the heart of it. And the ones that have had to pop off because of the coronavirus pandemic, the DSA is at the center of those things. I mean, thinking in particular of the Emergency Workers Organizing Committee that Meagan wrote about recently in Jacobin, which is an effort with DSA and with the United Electrical Workers Union that's trying to provide assistance to workers, most of whom are non-union, who are having to work throughout this pandemic and are in unsafe working conditions, and workers don't know how to respond to it. And so we, along with the union, are providing key assistance in helping people fight back on the job and organize with their coworkers to stop the bosses from, forcing them into potentially contracting COVID-19. There's really not much more that could be as crucially important for us to be doing right now than that. And I in the book, we try to take stock of everything besides Bernie's 2 campaigns that we have achieved in the last couple of years. I mean, we talk about successful electoral campaigns that have been run. We profile a couple of them. We lay out a theory of what good socialist electoral campaigns should look like. We talk about how we should engage with the Democratic Party, but we also just try to catalog the victories that have been won over the last 4 or 5 years, and those victories are really serious victories. I mean, they provide us a really important place from which we can now fight to change the world, and we've seen that DSA has played a really key role in those fights and will continue doing so in the future. So I think that the reason that the principal reason that we lost, that Bernie Sanders lost in his presidential run, I mean, there are things to talk about regarding his strategy, things he could have done differently. He could have been, meaner to Joe Biden or whatever. Whatever your pet theory you want to talk about, what he could have done better, I subscribe to that theory. But fundamentally, the problem was that we ran up against an establishment that is extremely powerful. And we just didn't have our forces amassed to the point where we could actually beat them. But we have made incredible strides on that front. And if we keep building DSA, both at the electoral level and in workplaces and in social movement work and fights for affordable housing and immigrant rights and all the rest of it, I honestly, truly believe that we have a very, very good chance of amassing the kind of forces where we can continue to win more victories in the future. So I hope that everybody who's on this call who's not in DSA will commit to joining DSA. And those who are already in DSA, keep your heads up, because we have achieved quite a bit over the past 4 years, and I feel confident in saying that we're only going to achieve more in the years to come. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Micah. Okay, let's turn to Daniel Cortez. Our next panelist is Daniel Cortez, the Legislative Director of the Portland, Oregon area local American Postal Workers Union. Yay, essential workers. He worked on Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign, actually, and was a speaker at some of the senators' rallies. So thank you so much for being here, Daniel. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, and it's great to see so many people here. I have to do a quick shout out to my union sibling, Jamie Partridge. Always great to see Jamie at events, and he is definitely continuing to lead the charge for us. I was asked to talk a little bit about why the APWU endorsed Bernie and what it means for us moving forward. Just to clarify a couple of things, though. Unfortunately, the APWU as a whole didn't endorse the senator. That's only a matter of timing, though. Our executive board, both in the 16 and in the 20 campaigns, endorsed him on behalf of the union. But as with any democratically run organization. Only the members can actually make that final endorsement. And our convention has actually been canceled because of the COVID, so we won't even get the opportunity to have that floor fight, which would have been a lot of fun. But the reason why so many postal workers and our executive board in particular have been behind the senator have been because he has stood as a champion for postal workers and for working Americans for a long time. Other people in the both chambers of Congress have stood with postal workers, but the senator has consistently been there for us. He was the lone senator to block all attempts of postal privatizers to be placed on the Postal Board of Governors, which was huge, helping to push back against what is now sort of the mantra from the White House, which is to privatize. Just recently, the senator hosted a town hall for the APWU and for all the major postal unions to talk about the future of the Postal Service and the essential work that we're doing. And it's fantastic on the one hand that we had a sitting senator take time out to host a virtual town hall broadcast nationwide to talk about the future of the Postal Service and how it's essential. But I think that the fact, more so than that he took the time to do it, the fact that he thought it was necessary, the fact that it needed to happen is what is more frightening to me. Why our leadership has gotten to such the point that it's not just obvious that the Postal Service needs to continue to exist for working people across the country. We just saw today the perfect example of why continuing the movement is important. This morning, the president talked about how he wasn't going to approve even the COVID relief money that Congress already allocated to the post office, let alone increase any of the desperately needed funds, unless the post office raised their prices and he had more control over operations, including union busting. Fortunately, he walked back some of those remarks later, but that just goes to speak directly to what it is that we're struggling with. I, for one, am pretty excited about the fact that the senator is still on the Oregon ballot in a few weeks, and I think that it's absolutely imperative for workers that we have that Bernie wins on Oregon by an even bigger margin than he did in 2016. That's the only way that I think that we are going to continue to show that the values that he is fighting for and what we need to move forward are still relevant. And even though we're not going to necessarily see as much of a positive outcome at the end of it as we would have liked, but without being able to continue to put the pressure on, I think we could be in trouble. So I'm calling on all of my friends and to continue to support Bernie through this. Let's give a fantastic showing on the upcoming primary and continue to move forward so that not only can things get put into the platform and the broader discussions can happen, but that we can actually demand real accountability for the issues that are important to people across the country. That's it. Thanks so much, and I look forward to questions if there are any.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. For people listening and watching right now, don't forget to sign in to our virtual sign-in sheet. We've linked that a few times in chat, and we'll be linking it more throughout the event. Let's go to our next panelist. Oh, yes, and also if you have questions for the panelists, feel free to put them in the Q&A question box now, and we will pose them to panelists during the Q&A portion, and they might answer them in text as we go through our panelists. Okay, so next panelist is Suzie Kassouf, an educator and organizer with the Youth Climate Justice Organization, Sunrise Movement PDX. Go ahead, Suzie.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm super excited and honored to be here repping Sunrise among such brilliant minds. That was just so great, and I'm feeling fired up. So Sunrise Movement, we are a group of young people who are fighting to stop the climate crisis and to really fight for climate justice. And if it wasn't for Bernie Sanders, the Sunrise Movement nationally probably would not exist. Most of its core founders really cited Bernie's 2016 run as inspiring them to start the Sunrise Movement. And I mean, I definitely would not be an activist or an organizer if it wasn't for Bernie. Bernie's the one who taught me that we can really build true power. And he's always said, you know, it's not me, it's about us. And just seeing, you know, a few months ago, I was watching Democracy Now! And Noam Chomsky was talking about how, you know, the Sunrise Movement really is the reason that everybody is talking about a Green New Deal. It's like almost a household name or word at this point. And I don't say that to like toot our own horn. I just say that to say like, we're just like kids, and we just like came together and have made like tremendous change and like huge shifts. And we're just like one little puzzle piece of this like huge movement that has really been like sparked in a lot of ways, or nurtured or nourished or grown by Bernie. And I loved what Meagan had to say, like that's not going away. And I think that, you know, this isn't like a particularly new take or anything, but we can't go back to the way we were before COVID-19, and we all know that. And as much as this crisis has really shown us, you know, the deep inequities in our society and how just horribly messed up things are in this country, there's also really never been such a clear and resounding alarm that we need to unite all of our movements for justice. Like you cannot have a Green New Deal without a jobs guarantee. That's workers' justice. The climate crisis is going to, no matter what at this point, it's going to create, it already is creating untold suffering and forced migration. That's migrant justice. You know, it's the peoples who've already been pushed to the margins of society, and it's the countries and the regions that have been colonized that are experiencing the worst effects of the climate crisis, the countries in Africa and South America and the Pacific Islands. And that's racial justice, that's indigenous justice. All of our movements for justice are united. And I really do believe that now is the time that they are coming together. And there is so much to grieve right now, and there's so much loss. I definitely had my whole heart in believing that Bernie was going to win. But I love Bernie too much to give up. And I love this world too much to give up. And I love its people too much to give up. So we're going to keep fighting. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Suzie. Okay, we now will hear from Adam McBride-Smith. He's been a co-chair of the Portland DSA Medicare for All campaign for the past year. Go ahead, Adam.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me. It is a great honor to share a stage, even a virtual one, with all of these speakers. As Laura said, I'm co-chair of the DSA Medicare for All campaign here in Portland. When people ask about what I do, I often say I'm a health justice activist. But unlike some of the people in this movement, local activists that I respect immensely, I haven't been working on single payer for decades. I just started showing up at DSA events about 2 years ago exactly. I voted for Bernie in the primary in 2016. I'd always believed in healthcare as a right, but it took a series of crises in my family to really push me over the edge and into action. And I remember at that time I felt deeply angry and powerless, and the Medicare for All movement and later the Bernie campaign gave me a pathway out of that feeling of disempowerment. I imagine for many of us that's the case. I say all of this for two reasons. First, to make the point that no matter where you're at in your own political evolution, whether you've been an activist for decades, an organizer for decades, or you've just come in from the cold, you are welcome and you are very much needed. And second, to convey my sense of some of the possibilities and the dangers of this very strange political moment that we find ourselves in. Because a situation in which 26 million people have lost their jobs in the span of 5 weeks, when millions of those people have already lost or will lose their health insurance in the middle of a global pandemic, it is no longer possible to ignore the vileness of our system. And a lot of people are going to get radicalized very quickly under those conditions, just like I was radicalized, just like many of us have been radicalized. And so one of our jobs moving forward has to be, I think, to ensure that people radicalize in the direction of hope and not in the direction of hatred. And the right is already getting out ahead of us in this battle. So the anti-lockdown protests that we've seen in the past week, although propped up by powerful interests that they may be, have the potential to spawn a new strain of an old political sickness, one that could draw in some of the same people that we need to be attracting to our ranks. Because make no mistake, when you're out of work, when you've lost your health insurance, when you can't get the unemployment office on the phone, when rent is coming due, and when you see no other alternatives, taking your chances with the virus in order to get a paycheck again sounds like a reasonable option. It's up to us to continue to make it clear that alternatives do exist and that we can win those alternatives by fighting for them. And one of the most painful ironies of this political moment is that in our moment of greatest need, one of the most visible and steadfast allies. But of course, Bernie Sanders was not Medicare for all. The movement for single payer existed before him, and it will carry on now that he has returned to the Senate. So let me give you a very brief idea of where I think the fight for health justice and Medicare for all is going as we move forward beyond Bernie. First, I think we should not betray our commitment to Medicare for all as single-payer healthcare. Establishment figures may try to push a public option in the coming months or years, and well-meaning progressives may echo that push. And a public option might make life better for a certain subsection of the population. But as writer Tim Faust and others have pointed out, it will likely leave the exact same people that our current system leaves behind. At heart, the public option is based on the premise of separate but equal. We have learned the lesson that separate but equal is never equal too many times in our history to fall for that again. Also, as the epidemiologist Dania M. Cato argued recently in Jacobin, Medicare for all should be the floor of our demands, not our ceiling. We also need hospitals that are geared toward public health and not profit. We need better working conditions for frontline healthcare workers and universal access to PPEs and testing kits. And finally, we must remember that housing is also health justice. As Suzie pointed out, environmental justice, climate justice is also health justice. Racial and disability justice are also health justice. That it is only in casting our solidarity wide enough to encompass all of these movements that we can win any of the changes. Berners and DSA and the Medicare for All campaign are working to do just that. And this week we're rolling out a campaign to pressure our representatives to support the Sanders-Jayapal Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act, which would expand Medicare to cover anyone who needs help during this crisis, which is also an important step towards a permanent expansion of public health. I'd encourage all of you to join us and get involved. We have events coming up this coming Thursday, and the following Thursday will be our bi-monthly campaign meeting. I'll drop some details in the chat, and feel free to reach out to us at dsam4a@gmail.com. DSAM, the number 4a@gmail.com. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Adam. Okay, our last panelist before we get to the Q&A for everyone is Albert Lee. You may have heard of him. Albert is a sixth-generation American and an immigrant at the same time. He was born in South Korea, where his African-American Army dad met his Korean mom during the Vietnam War. Raised in working-class North County, St. Louis, next to Ferguson, Albert experienced the struggles of many working-class, faced domestic violence and homelessness. With the help of others, he became a first-generation college and law school graduate, and most recently he was dean at PCC and stepped down in order to run to represent the people of the 3rd District of Oregon. Thank you so much for being with us. Albert, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me here. You know, like Meagan said at the very beginning, a lot of us got activated with Bernie Sanders in the 2015 and 2016 cycle. He was the one for me. He activated me. It was the first time I knocked on doors for someone, gave money to a politician, you know, made those phone calls, all of those things. That was something that was new for me. He solidified my entrance into the DSA. He solidified my interest into civic and electoral politics. Now, when Micah was talking about the loss, and it was a loss that we faced, but that loss was the culmination of the concerted efforts of a mainstream media combined with an establishment party that was fighting for its life. Because the fact of the matter is, Bernie was an existential threat to the establishment. He was bringing up and he was uplifting workers. He was uplifting the people, trying to get people to wake up to the realities that we have a two-party system where both parties are two sides of the same coin. That loss is, as much as it hurts, as much pain as it brings, we got to understand that Bernie is not the movement. He was a leader of the movement, but from him sprouted so many more. I mean, from 2018 to today, we've got hundreds of folks that have stood up to walk in his shadow, to help shore up and bring this fight, this electoral fight. Now, I mean, there's a lot of different strategies that we're going through. For some of us, we're standing up to try to strengthen the power within the halls of Congress, within the halls of government, through various levels of government. But we're going to have to take and lick our wounds from the defeat with Bernie and regroup within campaigns like mine, campaigns like others throughout the country. We need to help shore up now Senator Sanders in Congress, because as much as the presidency is important, it's even more important to have the right people in the legislative body, where the rules are actually made, where the laws are actually created. So that's first and foremost. Now I want to move on to what Suzie has talked about, and what COVID has brought to us is a lot of pain, but also it has brought to light a lot of things that are wrong with our system. We look at this for-profit, private employment-based health insurance system. It has collapsed. We've got 26 million people unemployed. That's 26 million people and their families without health care. The alternative that they want to throw people at is COBRA. I've been on COBRA before. You can't afford it. We need to have a single-payer universal Medicare system that's going to cover everyone. That's what's going to help to combat this crisis that we have, because if we don't take care of everyone, the COVID crisis will continue to linger. So that's one thing that COVID has brought. Another thing that COVID has demonstrated is that we can do something when it comes to our environmental issues. When we look at the forced curtailment of the use of fossil fuels throughout the world by our isolation, by our lockdown, we have seen dramatic changes in a matter of weeks around the world with air quality. So what we're talking about is not a lack of an ability, but a lack of political will. Now, how do we change that? We have to get the money out of politics. We have to start pushing and moving people that truly care about the people into office so that we can actually affect the change. So long as there's money in politics, we are going to have endless war. We are going to have the lack of universal Medicare for all. We're going to have this immense wealth gap. Right now, we are at peak capitalism. In 2015, 2016, Bernie was talking about 9 people owning as much as the bottom half of Americans. Today, he talks about 3 owning as much as the bottom half of Americans. Next year, it'll be 1. This will collapse on itself. Now, for our capitalist parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, they have to face this reality. They have to face this reality that the people are struggling. We are suffering, and we need relief. Here is one thing that I think could happen in light of the COVID crisis. This is an opportune time for us to have a debt jubilee. And what I mean by that is cancellation of all debt, not just cancellation of school loans, cancellation of medical debt, cancellation of mortgages, cancellation of credit debt. We need a complete reset. This is the time to do it. We, with our corporate parties, are always willing and ready to send trillions of dollars to bail out Wall Street. We did, $6 or $7 trillion invested into Wall Street. Then we took weeks to decide whether we were going to give $1,200 to people And then we limited to who could get that $1,200. And I don't know if everybody's gotten their $1,200 yet, one time. And even during that, another $500 billion was slipped in to corporations. Something's got to give. Bernie has inspired, he's awakened a lot of people to these realities. We need to move forward. We need to push forward. And quite honestly, if we don't have the political revolution, I'm afraid that there will be other types of revolution.
Thank you so much, Albert. Okay, so those are our panelists. If I could get all of our wonderful panelists to come back into video view so we can see everyone and hear your answers to these fantastic questions that we're getting from our audience. I'm going to start with a question. I think I'll give this one to Meagan. Jeremy asks, is there a particularly effective approach to explain to folks how American news media exists in large part to prevent or actively oppose any sort of leftward or progressive change?
That is a great question, and I think that coming off of Bernie 2020, the conversation on the left about the media has been dominant, which is good, but it's also been very vexing because we are realizing that we don't have independent left-wing media that's nearly strong enough to counter the effect of mainstream media, which is either sort of pushes a conservative Democrat viewpoint like MSNBC, or just a downright reactionary right-wing viewpoint like Fox News. And I will also say that a very important phenomenon that I think we all should try to wrap our minds around that has occurred leading up to this present moment is that because Donald Trump has used his platform on Fox News to talk about the fake news media, i.e. CNN and MSNBC, the Democrat cable news stations. Democratic Party loyalists, particularly Democrats who watch a lot of TV, so over a certain age, have actually, as Republicans' trust in the news media has plummeted, barring Fox News, obviously, always, Democrats' trust in the media has actually risen. They've split off in almost symmetrical fashion. This is a very unfortunate climate in which to be running an anti-establishment candidate who himself has major criticisms that are very legitimate of the mainstream media because it is pushing a pro-capitalist, anti-worker line, even when it represents the left side of the aisle. So this is a very unfortunate confluence of events that we managed to walk into. I mean, it wasn't even really like this in 2016 when Bernie Sanders ran, in the sense that the Democratic Party's base, or a certain section of that base, and a certain particularly very reliable, a segment of very reliable Democratic primary voters wasn't in 2016 so enamored of CNN and MSNBC in the way that it is now, and that's a product of the Trump phenomenon. So that's very unfortunate. I think that probably if you're asking for advice on how to have a conversation with someone, I think maybe starting there is a good place. But I also think that you should go deeper. We should all go deeper and explain that media corporations are corporations. When you're watching television, when you're reading the newspaper, you are interacting with a corporation that exists to make money. Producing news content is how they make money. But like all corporations, their purpose is not to produce news content. Their purpose is to make money. And Bernie Sanders, his entire program, not just his short-term social democratic platform, but in fact, the horizon that he was very clearly pointing toward, which went well beyond that, is very threatening to corporate profit-making in general, which means that the people at the top of these news stations have no interest in seeing a Bernie Sanders presidency. Now, they're not always handing down edicts to reporters. I think it's a little simplistic. It's important for us to establish that media corporations are corporations and they are run by CEOs who want the same things as all CEOs. But at the same time, we also can't Micah trains.
Sorry, I'm in my office.
Urban soundscape. We can't sort of cartoonishly accuse all reporters who say things that we don't like about Bernie Sanders of getting their marching orders from the top. There's actually a couple of different phenomena happening at once. These reporters are hired through a process that is set into motion by those people at the top. So yes, their fingerprints are on who gets to work where. right? And what their general political perspective is. But it's also the case that news reporters from mainstream media outlets have their own reasons for opposing anti-establishment candidates, particularly from the left, which is that they, in order to continue doing their job effectively and continue growing their own careers, because they're sort of miniature celebrities and the sky's the limit, right? They could become an Anderson Cooper or Tucker Carlson, right? They need to have really fat Rolodexes of people who are in charge, who can give them access to stuff. That's how you build a very lucrative career as one of these pundits or commentators in mainstream media. So they have no interest in alienating people who are in power and who appear to be projecting that they will remain in power. And that's one of the reasons that they get folded into the political power establishment. Even when they're not getting direct orders from the CEOs at the top, their interests are sort of aligning with them, right? So these are the reasons why mainstream media tends to be arranged against and very hostile to our project. It was compounded, of course, by the Trump effect and the great admiration that Democratic Party primary voters over the age of 55 or 60 have for CNN and MSNBC. Every time Trump calls them fake news, their admiration grows. This didn't work out well for us, unfortunately, and I hope that gives you a foothold into this very complicated and, like I said, vexing question.
Thank you, Megan. Okay, we have another question. Jamie asks, what's happening to the Postal Service and what can we do to support them? Daniel, if you would like to answer that.
Thank you. Great question. The Postal Service continues to be under tremendous attack from this White House. Twice in 2018, the White House released separate reports calling for the privatization of the Postal Service. And that attack is becoming even more paramount now with the massive decline in mail volume. People aren't sending mail right now. The companies are not sending coupons out and flyers and circulars to their customers to try and get them to come through their doors because businesses are closed. The major retailers aren't sending out catalogs like they were just a few months ago. So the projection is that if the physical distancing requirements continue, the Postal Service could lose as much as 50% of its mail volume by this summer. And as many of you know, the Postal Service receives no tax dollars for its operation. It relies entirely on the sale of postage. So with that much mail going down and no tax dollars coming in, the Postmaster General predicts that without a major influx of revenue, the Postal Service could actually be out of operating cash by October 1st of this year, which would be devastating to small businesses, rural Americans, veterans, anyone that relies on the Postal Service for their prescription medication, et cetera. So it's paramount that we get bipartisan legislation passed that will protect and preserve the People's Postal Service. We don't talk about the military running out of money. We don't talk about other government agencies needing a bailout. But for some reason, when it comes to continuing to provide the service that the Constitution calls on to exist, somehow it becomes controversial in leadership. So I'm sharing a link in the chat site. You can take action, just cut and paste that link to take you to the APW website where you can send a letter to your congressional representatives. And the other thing that we can do is pay attention to what's going on with it, as we all are, but let's talk to our family and friends in red states that may not necessarily agree with us. The saving the Postal Service is one of the easiest things that we can find common ground with the other side of the spectrum on, and it's imperative that we do so.
Great, thank you, Daniel. Okay, we have a question. I think I'll give this one to Adam. Kevin says, the book was excellent and cathartic in the wake of the suspension of Bernie's campaign. I think they're talking about the book Bigger Than Bernie, what Meagan and Micah co-authored. And Kevin asks, can you expound on your ideas for where socialists can be most effective in organizing the private sector? And I want to give this to Adam just because, with Medicare for All, that is an entirely privatized sector. in our society. So definitely happy to hear from Meagan and Micah after we hear from Adam. Go ahead.
Maybe they can give a better answer than I can. Can you repeat the question again? How to organize the private sector?
Do you have any ideas for where socialists can be most effective in organizing the private sector? And Kevin says, the globalization of capital and the extent to which companies like Amazon are willing to go to stamp out unions seem like particularly daunting challenges.
Well, I mean, I would say, you know, as someone who works on Medicare for All, that I think that Medicare for All is a great solidarity machine. It's certainly, obviously, an issue that's close to my heart. I think for a lot of people, it is something that they feel profoundly, that they've seen in their own lives. They've seen in their own lives the injustice of our healthcare system. They've seen it in their families. You know, I think this is true not just of people on the left, but, you know, people who would be more likely to fall across the aisle.
Great. Yeah, Micah, if you want to add something.
Yes, and apologies in advance if the train goes by behind me. It's very loud while I'm speaking. Yeah, so in the book in general, we have a section on the labor movement and socialist role in organizing unions. Like, what are some strategic openings that socialists could play a role in? And I guess before speaking about that, it's important to just note that generally in American labor history, socialists have played really key organizing roles in building unions in both the private and the public sector in American labor history. And I think if we're going to rebuild the labor movement in the 21st century, if we're going to organize the private sector in particular, socialists are going to have to play a really key role in doing that. Socialists have never done that by themselves. They've always done so as part of a broader, you know, current of class struggle focused rank and file organizers. But that's we're going to play a really key role in doing that in the immediate future. We're publishing an article tomorrow in Jacobin that I just finished editing before this call started that is about Amazon, for example. Amazon is one of the few companies right now that is hiring, I believe, 100,000 new employees right now. And as we know, many people, including many socialists, are currently out of work and going to work at Amazon as part of, you know, not just sort of on your own wage a one-person struggle against one of the most powerful corporations in the world, but like as part of a broader effort to organize Amazon is a really good idea right now. There's incredible strategic leverage that workers in companies like Amazon or other companies that have been deemed essential right now, there's incredible leverage in organizing those companies. And so socialists should see, I mean, not everybody needs to go work at Amazon, but like a chunk of us should see that as our role to go, foment some trouble there. I mean, folks probably know that within the last, since the pandemic kicked off, there have been a bunch of strikes at companies like Instacart and Whole Foods and other corporations that are still functioning during this pandemic and that people are relying on during this pandemic. And even just small, actions that are led by small numbers of workers have gotten enormous amounts of attention and have actually wrung concessions out of these giant corporations. All of that is a long way of saying that there are, especially in the industries that are seen as essential right now and where people are still working in the private sector, there are enormous opportunities for socialists to either, go work at a company like Amazon and organize yourself with your coworkers, or through something like EWOC that I mentioned earlier, the Emergency Workers Organizing Committee, through DSA, support people who are doing that kind of organizing to help push for more workplace organizing and strikes and all the rest of it, because now is a critical, it's literally a life and death issue at this point. So we socialists have to be really deeply involved in that.
Great, thank you, Micah. Real quick, before we move to the next question, Daniel, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just really quickly, the single biggest thing I think that we can do to impact private sector organizing, one is help support and protect the labor unions, particularly shameless plug, the postal unions, the public sector unions. If we go, then it'll be even that much harder for the private sector unions to gain strength. But the biggest thing is we must and have to repeal the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 that absolutely gutted labor rights in this country and is what's single-handedly preventing probably most of the gains that we can and could be having.
Great. Okay. Let's see. I've got a question for Suzie. Sorry. Okay. Melissa asks, what would be your response to a young person who feels hopeless about the future and sees no reason to engage in politics?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that it's kind of okay to be hopeless sometimes. We're living through, such dark, overwhelming times right now. And this eco-philosopher that I really love, Joanna Macy, she says, like the Buddhists would say, if you're worrying all the time, you don't really have to be like brimming with hope. If you're worrying all the time, like, am I hopeful? Am I not hopeful? Like that can really wear you out. What's really important is just being present and just showing up. This is something I've really learned about doing this work is that it's really not about win or lose. It's about like the feeling that you get from doing the work and because otherwise I always have this kind of nagging feeling in the back of my mind that's like the world's ending, I'm not doing anything about it, and I have this like guilt and this shame and it like overwhelms me. But when I show up and I do the work, that goes away, and then I find like a tremendous amount of community and purpose with the people in my life. Rebecca Solnit, she wrote a book called Hope in the Dark, and something that I try to constantly remember, she tells this story in the beginning of the book about how this woman so this woman tells this story about how she was like huddled in the rain outside of the White House. She was like an anti-nuclear movement or something, and just like huddled in the rain with like a group of women outside of the White House. And she was just like, what am I doing? Like, this isn't making any difference. Like, I'm just wasting my time. And then like many years later, she found out that I need to memorize this person's name, but somebody who ended up being really influential in the movement really decided to get involved in the movement and change his life when he saw this group of women huddled in the rain outside of the White House. So we really don't know the consequences of our actions. And she talks about activist work as really just like laying tinder. Like you're just laying it down with the hope that that a spark will light and things can change really fast. And we've seen examples of that, countless examples of that throughout history. I was born in 1989. That's the year the Berlin Wall fell. And so I heard that pretty much nobody expected that to happen 6 months or a year before. Everybody thought we'd be in this like capitalist communist duality for the centuries. There's been tremendous changes that have happened very fast, and they can happen again. And before I wrap up, I forgot to say this before, but one of our main campaigns recently with Sunrise PDX is we had a robust and democratic process to endorse a slew of champions for justice here in Oregon. And so if you get your ballot in the mail and you're like, oh, Multnomah County Commissioner, I don't know, like we've got you covered. So you just go to sunrisepdx.org. I'm going to put that right here in the chat, sunrisepdx.org. We've got a voting guide there, and share it with your friends, because I really believe, workplace organizing, so important, but I also really believe in gaining political power. And just because Bernie's out, as Albert Lee would say, we still have really important elections to win here in Oregon. So just don't give up, because why not? Who cares if you're wrong, and who cares if you get hurt? Your heart will heal. You got to live while you're alive and fight the good fight. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you, Suzie. Yeah, I agree. I feel so much better when I just show up and do work. Like, I instantly feel so much better. Let's see. Okay, so I've got a big one. I'm going to hit like 10 questions at once because we've got so many people in the Q&A box asking a question relating to a very similar topic. So I'm going to try to synthesize. So a lot of people lately have been talking about the Democratic Party and possibly forming some sort of workers' party, or, you know, what do we do with this political party situation? So I want to pose a question to Albert, since you are actually running for office. Certainly not a friend of the Democratic establishment, but of course running, you know, on the Democratic ballot line. So what do you think about, you know, can the Democratic Party be saved? What should our role be in, you know, like, what should our relationship be with the Democratic Party going forward? Do you have any, what do you think about the idea of, you know, forming a workers' party or some sort of formalized structure outside of the Democratic Party?
So Bernie ran in the Democratic Party 2 times now. And the reason why he did so is because we have a 2-party duopoly that exists. That is the regime that we have right now. We've had this discussion within my campaign a lot, just a long debate about it. You know, in 2015 and 2016, there was the whole Dem Enter, Dem Exit discussion. The reality is a third party is not going to be successful at the presidential level and is rarely successful at lower levels. You know, we've had a couple of successes where I think Jesse Ventura beat out both the Democrat and the Republican in Minnesota. And I think we came close with Teddy Roosevelt with the Bull Moose presidential run back at the turn of the 1900s. But generally speaking, the system is rigged for a 2-party system. That is why Bernie ran in the Democratic Party these last 2 times. In order for that to change, in order for us to have any kind of a chance or an idea of looking at a third party, workers' party, to go up against these 2 corporate parties, is things are going to have to change within the rules of how things are working. One of the things that I'm looking at, looking in Congress, is looking at HR 4000, which is the Fair Representation Act. What that would do is 2 things. It would incorporate ranked choice voting, and it would take our current single-member representational districts and make it multi-representational districts. So, for instance, here in the 3rd district, we're about 80% Democrat. So that means 20% of the folks that live here just simply aren't represented because they have differing opinions or views. If we had a larger district with multiple representatives in that district and you provide a ranked choice voting, then you open the ability to have more than this 2-party duopoly. But without having some kind of a change within the way that we elect people, I just don't see how a third party is going to be futile, is going to come to fruition. Now, I think that a lot of people are starting to realize that these 2 parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, are the same party. And I think that there is a frustration and there's a yearning for a third party. But in order to make a functional third party, an effective third party, we're going to have to change the rules. In order to change the rules, you have to get in there to change the rules. So it's sort of a circular argument. So I know that there are hundreds of us that are trying to get in through the Democratic Party. I know there's others that are trying to do it through an independent route, which is even more difficult. But if we get, say, 10 or 15 solid, real fighters into Congress, that could form a voting bloc that could provide us the leverage in order to get some of these things changed, because you're looking at a 50-50 deal on the federal level, at least. And to have a block of 10 or 15 would go a long way to help us get there. I'm happy to hear what other folks have got to say about this as well.
Great, thank you, Albert. Megan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. My perspective is quite similar. So I'll start, and Micah and I lay this out in much more detail in the book that we wrote. I'll start by saying that the Democratic Party is a party of capital. That we should, I hope that all of us agree on that. I think it's been made abundantly clear. And it's not just that they're a uniquely pro-capitalist party. In fact, I think it was, I can't remember if it was Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan's, one of their speechwriters called the Democratic Party history's most second enthusiastic party of capital. So that's what we're dealing with here. But it's also the case that even if the Democrats weren't so bad, in order to do what we want to do, which is affect transformational change that is pro-worker and anti-capitalist, we're going to need an independent working class party. And the reason for that is because if you have a cross-class coalition that says that it's trying to advocate on the part of one class against another class, and those classes' interests are diametrically opposed to each other, which is something that socialists do believe, then ultimately the class with the more power is going to win out inside of that coalition. And that's not going to work for our purposes. So if we really want to break through and start, actually changing fundamentally the structure of society, we're going to need an independent working class party. Now, easier said than done. I think that when a lot of people first realize how craven the Democratic Party establishment is, they immediately say it's time for, a Dem exit. And you won't find any argument from me on the point itself, the sort of underlying point. But it's also the case that nothing would make, the Democratic Party establishment top brass happier than for those of us who've been publicly antagonizing them for half a decade to take our ball and go somewhere else, right? And we don't want them to breathe that easy, I think. So I think I want to return to a story from Bernie Sanders' life, which is actually really instructive, which is that he co-founded the Liberty Union Party. It was an independent third party in the state of Vermont, and he ran as their candidate for various positions, including governor several times. And ultimately he resigned in the late 1980s after never cracking 5% or so. And in his resignation letter, he said, and this is something that he got obviously from his earlier socialist education as a member of the Young People's Socialist League and elsewhere in the sort of the New Left. He said, the purpose of an independent working class party, and I'm paraphrasing but lightly, is to create a scenario in which working class people rightfully take what belongs to them. And if you have an organization that calls itself a party, then is able to secure a ballot line, but that is not rooting itself in the working class, that has not secured a place in the popular working class imaginary, then it's not really serving that function of a working class party. In the case of the Liberty Union Party, he found that actually they were spending most of their time trying to maintain their ballot line access because it's so difficult in our extremely rigid two-party system. So they ended up, not being able to do any non-electoral organizing, which would have rooted them deeper in the working class and allowed them to begin behaving like an independent working class party. Essentially, they were a party in name only, not in function. We're looking to build kind of a mass party, a party with mass character. Millions of people would be a part of this party. Labor unions would be strong and they would be constituent elements of this party. This party might root itself in civil life differently. And throughout the history of socialist parties across the world, you've seen socialist parties have, serve a sort of community function. They've had in Germany there were socialist beer halls. There have been socialist sports leagues that have been connected to parties. It's a real sense of political identity and community that's necessary to steel working class people as they really go to battle against the forces of capital. And that's what we want to build eventually. Now, if we go build a tiny organization that has its own ballot line and we say that it's a working class party and it's completely marginal in the broader scheme of things, we haven't actually achieved our goal. Something that our comrade, he's a DSA member, Robbie Nelson, often says is it's not a party till there's a crowd. So how do we get the crowd is the question. And I think that running on the Democratic Party ballot line is an occasionally and I think frequently useful way to get our ideas in front of millions of people so as to create a new political constituency with which we could confidently march out of the Democratic Party and have something approximating an independent workers' party, not simply an abstentionist organization for a few diehards who want to make a point, even if the point's correct. So that's my sense of the terrain right now. It makes me a realist on the question of third parties as an option at the moment. I don't think that on the national stage they are, but I do think that DSA should be running our own candidates, that they should be antagonizing the Democrats as vocally as possible, and that they should not strongly self-identify as Democrats. They should just be running on the Democratic Party ballot line. I think that they should be building movements, they should be connected to movements, disciplined to movements, and ideally not to the Democratic Party establishment, which is difficult, but better if you have organizations like DSA at your back. And I think that I don't know if I said this already, but independent runs, when possible, is a very good idea. Democratic Party ballot line runs, when that makes more sense, is also fine, because the purpose is to lay the foundation for a successful break from the Democratic Party. This is why Mike and I differentiate, following Eric Blanc, who's a writer for Jacobin. We differentiate between a clean break, which is right now we start a third party, goodbye, and a dirty break. We're going to get our hands dirty in Democratic Party politics as we prepare for a break and make that break as successful as possible.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is clearly a really popular topic, something that really animates people. And I am sure that our Portland DSA chapter will have many more conversations about this over the next few months. So yeah, thank you so much for all your answers to that question. I'm going to go to, I think, I have another one for Adam. So we have two questions about demographics. So Rick asks, that Bernie showed electoral strength with certain demographics, and what demographics do we need to continue winning over, and how do we do that? And then someone else asked, Conrad asked, Bernie performed significantly worse than his 2016 effort in rural and small town areas of the Midwest. And how can we account for that? So Adam, I want you to answer this because, you know, with Medicare for All, obviously we have things that appeal very much to like older generations, which Bernie was weak with. And then of course, you know, rural places losing access to healthcare, like hospitals and things like that. So do you have any thoughts about appealing to certain rural and small town areas, and also generational, like bridging the generational divide? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I've thought about this sometimes, that I think the single payer movement, the long-standing single payer movement, tends to skew older, which, you know, kind of in some ways sets it apart from the rest of the larger socialist movement. And you know, I think even the framing of Medicare for All, it seems to me, is on, you know, on the one hand, it's hard to explain to people what single payer is. People know what Medicare is. You can convey that concept to them more easily with the Medicare framework. It's also, you know, it's a way of saying this is a system that exists now. We can build it out. It's just a matter of building it out. So it kind of makes something that is not familiar to Americans, that's familiar to much of the rest of the world, but it is not familiar to Americans. The idea of single payer, it makes it familiar and it makes it seem American. But I think it's also, that framing is intended, you know, to not scare older people who, you know, might be scared by other ways of framing the argument. So I don't know. I don't know if that's coming close to answering the question. I think that we do need to continue to make the case that an issue like Medicare for All, as all of these issues are, you know, as Meagan has written, Medicare for All is a queer issue. It is about supporting trans rights. It's about supporting people of color. That these issues affect those communities the most deeply, and, you know, the most profoundly. And I think, yes, how do we make that case to people in rural areas? That's another question that I think we need to answer. How we reach out to people in rural communities. You know, I mean, I think a lot of us, we live in urban centers. We think in terms of urban centers, but there are DSA groups that are, for example, that are, you know, where my mom lives in East Tennessee. There's at ETSU, there's a pretty active young DSA group, and I think we need to reach out to those groups and see how we can support them, what they're doing, and speaking to their communities in fairly rural areas. So I don't know. That's a kind of roundabout way of answering that question, and I would love to hear what other panelists have to say about it.
Thanks so much, Adam. Albert, did you real quickly want to add something?
Yeah. So I just wanted to challenge the question, actually, because I think that, when you look at 2016 versus 2020, there was a difference. And that difference was that we had a Democratic Party that added and piled on tons and tons of different candidates, 20 plus different candidates, each of which took on a portion of Bernie's platform, picked it up and kind of twisted and distorted it. So then we came out with a Medicare for those who want it. We came out with a variety of different tweaks to Bernie's message, which was really created to cause confusion. And so I think that, I don't know if the performance was different because the message wasn't resonating, but rather that it was being confused with all the multitude of different candidates that were added into the whole scheme. I mean, now you add on to that mainstream media giving hyper focus to irrelevant candidates like Delaney getting half an hour on TV when we all knew he was irrelevant. We see the combination of mainstream media along with the party itself there to try to take apart the Sanders movement and confuse it all. And then I also want to address another thing that I think is really important, and that is the repetition of a lie that media kept saying about Black folks. When you looked at the demographics, Bernie outpaced almost every single candidate when it had your under 30 Black votes. Now, as you got higher in age, yes, there was a difference. But what mainstream media did was it made that as if the Black vote was one monolithic vote. And then they just kept hammering the same lie that Bernie wasn't resonating with Black folks. And they said it long enough and hard enough and with a lot of repetition to make it a reality.
Great, thank you, Albert. Okay, one of our last questions I'm going to give to Suzie. So there's a couple questions I'm going to try to synthesize. They're on the similar vein. So let's see. So Alex asks about the not me, us philosophy of Bernie and, how we're emphasizing the platform and the community collective aspect of organizing, and so Alex asks, can we ever run a successful campaign based on unified ideals rather than charismatic individuals? And then Alex also asks about how Americans don't really see themselves as part of the working class, at least it's growing obviously these days, but how do we get people to see themselves as part of a class of people with the same interests, and how can we do that without a unifying figure like Bernie Sanders, and how does that relate to the work that you're doing, Suzie?
Thanks. Well, first of all, I have no idea. I hope so. In some ways, I've always kind of thought that leaders are important because they galvanize people. But I think the best sort of leader is the kind of leader like Bernie who creates tons of leaders. I'm definitely not as smart as everybody in this chat, and I appreciate being here, but the way I see it is the ways we're going to get big change is when people get involved, actually involved. There's 40% of the people here who aren't in DSA. So great. I wonder, are you in another group? You don't have to be in DSA. You can be in Sunrise. You can be in Medicare for All. You can be in a group fighting for migrant justice. But yeah, to the second question, how do we get people to realize they're all part of the united class? I wish I knew that. I feel that I'm always wondering this all the time. And in a way, I think that language to people can put people off, which is what I've always loved about Bernie, is he's always found this way to be we are united. It's not like landlords versus renters, necessarily. It's not like the whole property owners and like not, it's just kind of like dated, I think. Like there's a wealthy few that want to divide us. There's like a few people who have billions of dollars while so many of us are struggling. And 99% of us can come together and really change things. I remember Bernie, I'm just rambling at this point, but like, yeah, I don't know. I think get involved, I think. Great.
Thanks, Suzie. Okay, we are about out of time. I want to mention real quick that we're actually going to be having an after party, well, a hangout after the panel. And let's see, if Melissa, if you want to drop the link in chat, it's another Zoom meeting. So if you want to talk to people who were here about the panel and what you heard and just discuss it in a more informal way, we're having, it's like going to the bar after the event, you know. So that's what we'll be doing in a few minutes. Let's see, we have just a couple minutes left. I'm seeing if there's a real quick question. Panelists, if there's something, if any panelist has any like additional thoughts you want to sprinkle in before we end, go ahead and jump in. I don't see any that would only take about a minute to answer. Meagan, yeah, Meagan, go ahead.
I just have a final thing to say, which is that I was so impressed and happy to see how many people on this call are not yet members of DSA, and I'd like to encourage you to consider joining DSA if you haven't already. I think that socialist organizations provide unique things. One of these things is political education, which is absolutely critical. And I don't just mean political education in terms of reading stuff that you're certainly not going to come across in normal capitalist society. I also mean political education through action. A socialist organization does electoral work and non-electoral work. It's a year-round organization. You can get your hands dirty out in the real world, and there's no substitute for that kind of political education, especially when it's done alongside rigorous reading, which DSA has reading groups. I'm sure that Portland DSA has fantastic political education. And also a sense of community. I mean, we live in a very alienated, atomized society, no time more than when many of us are experiencing isolation in our homes due to a pandemic. I think that being a part of a socialist organization, one shouldn't do that simply to experience community. You should probably also be a socialist and want to destroy capitalism. But it's also true that it can bring a great deal of social meaning to your life. And I don't think that that's a bad thing at all. I think that's really wonderful. It certainly brought that to my life. So I encourage people to join DSA or consider it.
Great note to end on. Join DSA. You can do so easily by going to dsausa.org/join. 6:30 on the dot. Thank you all so much for being here. I want to say thank you again to all our wonderful panelists, Meagan Day, Micah Uetricht, Daniel Cortez, Suzie Kassouf, Adam McBride-Smith, and Albert Lee. Thank you again so much. Feel free to, panelists, if you want to post in the chat, if people can get in touch with you in any particular way, like Twitter handles or whatever. So yes.